Dr. Tanya Wright into this space. Am I right? I'm not going to do a formal bio for Dr. Tanya Wright, but I just wanted to share that she is a professor at MSU, and she has been a part of the network since the very inception of the network. And actually, even before that, when you think about one of the things that brought us together as a network were the essential instructional practices K-3. She is a co-author of those. She cares deeply, deeply about our network and really inspires us in her way of helping us think about what we bring as coaches, the knowledge, the skills. And we are just so grateful to have you with us today, Dr. Wright, to learn from you. So if you can just please give her a silent, warm welcome in your space or in the chat, we would greatly appreciate it. Thanks for being here today, Dr. Wright.
Maybe some thumbs upping. Okay, cool. All right. So what I was asked to talk about today was based on maybe some of the questions that folks had after our fun summer at Coach Camp in Traverse City. And particularly to talk about some updates and reminders for Essential 9, which is focused on assessment. So I wanted to talk through some of the updates to that essential today, just in a little bit more detail, and give you some reminders, but also maybe some new ideas that we haven't talked about for Essential 9. So I just want to highlight up front some of the new text, or the slightly different text that I want to have some time for us to talk about today. So you can see if it's in yellow, we're going to talk about it. So it says, engages in observation and other forms of assessment that are not biased by race, socioeconomic status, or other factors in bullet 1. And I want to talk a little bit about that language. It's a little different and new to what we had before. I want to talk about, I'm going to skip to the fourth major bullet where it says to inform next steps in classroom instruction. We have talked about that before. But I just want to do some reminders about that based on some of the questions that we've been getting about different types of assessments. And then to build on the strengths of each child, we're going to talk about that a little later on, mostly because I want to have time for discussion about it, because it's so important. So I didn't say it last because it's least important. I said it last because I actually think it's one of the most important updates that we put in here. And I want to take some time to talk about that today. So that's the plan. Okay. I am not able to monitor the chat that well when my slides are on. So if there's an important question for me, maybe someone can let me know. Okay. Okay, so I wanted to talk about a slight wording change, which was this idea about engaging in an observation and other forms of assessment. So it used to say something close to engaging in observation and assessment, which sounded like observation was not actually a type of assessment, but was a different thing to assessment. So sort of like observation somehow were different or less than other kinds of assessment, like maybe tests or something like that. So we wanted to change that wording because observation is a type of assessment, and a really critical type, right? That we really want to emphasize in classrooms with teachers. When we think about observation as assessment in classrooms, really what we're up to is we're watching what kids are doing as readers, writers, speakers, listeners, and learners. And we're doing some systematic recording of that to understand where kids are in their thinking in order to inform instruction. So there are lots of types of assessment that we can use in the classroom, right? Traditional tests, analysis of work samples or portfolios of work, discussions. What do kids say during discussions? And I said, or interviews, as in when we talk to them one-on-one, right? Performance task, that's things like kids might be sharing a presentation or doing a reader's theater or doing some sort of play or skit, right? Those are all performance tasks. Or we might ask them to engage in something like, doing a math problem and sharing what their thinking is during it, right? That's a type of performance task. Or science project and sharing what they're up to, or science exploration. Writing tasks or written response, right? We might give kids a prompt and ask them to respond to something specific, short or longer answer. That's another type of assessment that we can use to figure out where kids are in their thinking. So there's lots of types of assessment that can give us lots of information about where kids are in their learning and thinking. And I think the most important thing to remember here is that observation is one type. And I wanted to actually just briefly bring us back to a video that we might have looked at quite a while ago, for those of you who have been around the network for a while. We're not going to watch the whole thing today, but I want to just remind everyone, and especially for folks who might be newer, what it looks like when we use observation as assessment. So hopefully I can make this work. And we're going to watch just 3 little snippets of this video because I always feel like it's so much better to see it than to hear me tell about it. So let's look into this classroom and see what this teacher is up to. I'm just going to increase this in size and hopefully get to play it for all of you. Can someone again let me know if it doesn't work for some reason? Okay, here we go.
Ongoing observation and assessment of language and literacy development should inform literacy instruction. In this classroom, the teacher prioritizes observation during actual reading and writing.
So today when you guys are reading independently, I want you to continue to think about the author's purpose, and I want you thinking about, why did the author write this? What does the author want me to know or to explain? So you're going to find a quiet spot and an informational textbook that you can read to think about the author's purpose. The particular standard I'm looking at today is whether or not students understand the author's purpose when they're reading informational text. You can see on the side, I wrote down the questions that I'll be asking students just so I don't forget them on the side, so it's right there in front of me on the page where I'm taking notes. So some of those questions that I'm going to ask today are, what is the main purpose? What does the author want me to know, or you to know? And what is the author trying to explain? What do you think the author wants us to know when we're reading this book?
That the pandas are getting nearly extinct and try to save them.
So you think the purpose of this book is that different ways that we can
Help pandas.
help pandas? Let's open up and read a few pages and see if that seems.
I'm going to scoot on a little bit and then we'll talk about it after. Just want to get to the next spot here.
I have a few different ways that I take notes so that I can have a really good understanding of student knowledge. I often use different sheets to record my observations with students. The sheet that I used today has the standard and then all of the students listed on it, so that as I'm going through, I can take a look and see what students still need practice with that standard, who's able to do it independently. It kind of gives me a snapshot across my classroom. And then I use that to transfer information onto another sheet that has the standards, and there's just one child per sheet for this. And that gives me a really good understanding for each child individually, what they still need to practice or what they're secure with. I write down a variety of things. I write down the title of the book, the genre of the book, I write down answers that the students might give me to the questions. I'm looking specifically if they're able to use the strategy that we're working on, in this case, author's purpose and an informational text. And sometimes I'm writing down some misconceptions they might have or what they can do independently. So I'm note-taking in a lot of different ways. So once they've shown me that they can meet the standard, I mark it with an S, which means secure.
Last little section coming up. Let's watch this in action with one more child.
What are you reading today?
I'm reading a National Geographic book,
Annette, what's the title of this book?
Tiger in Trouble.
Ah,
It's not just about tigers. It's about these animals that live somewhere, but they had to move to a zoo.
interesting, because I'm noticing that this is a chapter book, and it looks like you're on about the last chapter in the book. So have you noticed something that was similar about the
story?
other chapters?
Similar. Yeah. That all of them like lived somewhere. They were just fine, but then they were not fine. They just kept getting sick, and then they went to a zoo. And the caretakers at the zoo, they cared for them very much.
So if you think about the author, the person who wrote this, what is the author trying to explain in all these stories about animals that were sick and then went to the zoo to be cared for?
He's trying to explain about you should care about all animals.
Do you have any connections to that from any other stories we've been reading?
Yeah,
What is that?
about Ivan.
How is that book? 'Cause that's a fictional book. How is that similar to this one?
Since it wasn't like a true story, it was just made up. It still had animals that are sick and that weren't were not taken care of well, and they ended up going to a zoo.
So what you're doing is you're making connections, because this is a nonfiction book, and you're making a connection to a fiction book called The One and Only Ivan. And you're seeing that in both books, the author wants you to know that it's important to take care of animals. So you're thinking about the theme between two different books. Really excellent job reading. Keep doing that while you finish. It can be challenging.
Okay, so so that example, if we had watched the whole thing, you would have also seen the teacher sort of listening and note-taking as kids were reading independently. So it's sort of a combination observation, interview / discussion, right? Discussion with note-taking that we're seeing. But you could see in the example with the last child, just how much information that brief interaction the teacher can get. First of all, definitely this child knows the author's purpose and main idea. That was not even a question. But above and beyond that is able to make connections across texts, right? Different types of text, which is actually another standard that we're interested in, right? Relating one text to another. Able to summarize across different chapters within a text and really look for the main point, right? So there's a lot going on there about that student's comprehension, reading comprehension, right? That was picked up in this small interaction. And perhaps, we could give a whole bunch of passages with questions in some sort of out of context way, and we still might not know as much as in that very brief interaction around a text about what the student knows and can do and can figure out. So I'm hoping, I'm going to share my slides again. I'm hoping that it was just sort of like a reminder as to what this might look like and what we're trying to encourage when we're saying observations during reading and writing, and also formative assessment, right? Assessment to inform instruction. So we're looking for what this child already knows, their strengths, right? And how we can use that information to figure out what to talk about and what to teach next. Okay, so that was a little reminder about observation being a type of assessment, a very important type of assessment, and how we can use interactions during real reading and writing, and also discussions with kids, and do systematic note-taking to see where kids are in their thinking and what they figured out and what they understand. The next part of the Essential 9 that I want to talk about today is the statement that says forms of assessment that are not biased, and it talks about different types of biases that we might have as part of assessment. And I want to just talk about that in three different ways. Okay. One idea here is that there can be bias built into an assessment, into the type of questions we ask that may be more supportive systematically of some kids than others. I was talking to colleagues about this yesterday, and a colleague who studies math said that there are always snowman math problems, right? That assume kids know something about a snowman and what it is and how it works. And that there have been studies of kids who live in warmer places, or maybe new immigrants from warmer places, who can't or are disadvantaged in some way, right, to do that problem because they don't have a set of knowledge associated with the ideas that the problem is about. I've been just hanging out with a lot of math folks lately. And these are good to think about, right? Another example that someone said to me is, why are our math problems always girls doing cooking? And problems about speed, always boys doing sports, right? That's bias, right? That's gender-based bias. So there are all sorts of bias that can be built into an assessment. And one thing that's important, and this is a literacy leadership idea, is that if you're the school or district you work with is ever adopting a new assessment, it's really important to make sure that that assessment underwent, I don't know if that's a good word, a full bias review, and has a panel that is looking at every single item to make sure that there is no bias built into the items in that question. It can be anything, right? It can be so much as it's an experience that more rural kids who grow up in more rural environments are likely to have, but urban environments might never have seen or experienced, right? So there's a lot to think about with that. That's usually not at the classroom teacher level. That's much more at the assessment development level. But it is true that we can develop our own formative assessments that have bias built into them, and that is something that folks really need to be aware of. So there's bias built into assessment development that needs to be considered. But more often, what is really relevant in classrooms are the next two bullets, because these are things that are sort of at the teacher level, right? The first is bias in interpreting an assessment. So how we score students and what we score. At the Summer Institute, we talked about things like marking kids as not knowing phonics or phonemic information because of their accent or dialect, right? That's bias. And that's bias in interpretation of assessment, where we might make assumptions about what kids know based on the language they speak or how they speak in some way, right? This is the same as there's a lot of evidence that implicit bias impacts how teachers grade, right? When they look at something like kids writing, they may have different sort of standards of what's acceptable and be more harsh in their grading of certain kids. So this is something really important to be thinking about and talking about and aware of, right? And making teachers aware of, so that they're sort of checking themselves, checking their processes to make sure that they're consistent, right? And one of the ways that we do that is we use tools to ensure consistency, right? So creating a formal checklist or a rubric that clearly says what constitutes success on a particular assessment item is a way to ensure that there's like fair criteria that are used across kids in a classroom or from classroom to classroom, right? And the more we can make sure that that different teachers in different classrooms are using that rubric consistently, for example. So those are the kinds of things that a coach can work on with a school or with a grade level team. If we're going to have a checklist, if we're going to have a rubric, how do we design it so that it's very clear and criteria are clear, and we can use it consistently to try to eliminate bias in interpretation? The last way that we can think about bias when we're thinking about assessment is that implicit bias can influence how educators, how teachers think about how well kids will do or what they will learn. And actually, there's some evidence coming out. This is Dr. Brandy Gaitlin-Nash. She's awesome, out of UC Irvine. This is her paper. It's actually cited in the Literacy Essentials. It's one of the citations in Essential 9. And she did the study where she showed that when teachers learn how to do careful formative assessment to inform instruction in careful ways, it actually can help to eliminate bias that teachers may have about kids. So what they did in the study is they had teachers sort of rate kids' academics, like how well do you think this kid does in literacy in math? And they found a lot of bias in that, particularly around socioeconomic status, where teachers rated kids as sort of doing less well academically, right, or likely to do less well academically if they were a child who received who qualified for free and reduced lunch. So there's a lot of systematic bias in how teachers were rating what kids knew and could do in literacy and math. However, when and that systematic bias actually influenced kids' growth. In other words, when teachers had rated kids as lower, those kids grew less. So it suggests that like teachers' impressions of kids and their bias can actually carry over into maybe what they teach kids or what kids learn. So it's not a good situation. However, when they taught teachers to systematically engage in formative assessment, so regularly to look in systematic, careful ways, with data and rubrics at where kids were in their progress, teachers were less likely to show evidence of bias around kids' socioeconomic status. In other words, carefully looking regularly at kids and what they can do in a systematic way can help to eliminate the biases, maybe, right, that people may naturally have. So this is a plug for engaging in regular formative assessment and having processes for that, because it can actually help teachers to have a better idea of where kids really are in their learning, and maybe not ideas that are impacted by implicit bias. Okay. So those are 3 different ways to think about bias and why we're talking about forms of assessment or ways of engaging of assessment that are not biased. Okay, another part of the language that we changed a little bit, or maybe it was there before, but it says it maybe more explicitly now, is that this assessment is in order to inform, we want to use assessment to inform next steps in classroom instruction. So let's consider some examples and decide if they are to inform next steps in instruction. Here we go. Administrators need to figure out staffing. So they need to know the number of kids who need tier 2 reading support likely next year, because they have to make sure they have enough, FTEs for staffing next year. Okay, well, that might require screening assessment, right? But it's not assessment to inform instruction, right? There's a different purpose for this assessment. It doesn't mean that it's less important. Obviously, we want to make sure that we know how many kids are going to need support so that the right number of people can get hired, and there's funding for that. But this is a little different to what we're talking about classroom teachers doing. So we need systems of assessment that include this kind of information, but are not maybe the kinds of assessment that are most helpful to classroom teachers. Here's another example. Teachers need to know which consonant sounds, which consonants kindergartners, there's some missing S, already know in order to decide what to teach next during small group instruction. Okay, well, that's to inform instruction, right? And the only way we can really figure that out is to do an activity or mini assessment with a child and show them some letters and see if they know the sounds that those consonant letters make and which ones they do and don't know. So now we're talking about more informal and formative assessment that's going to help a teacher figure out what to do tomorrow at small group instruction. Okay, here's another example. The legislature wants to know how Michigan students are doing in reading across communities to make decisions about education spending in the state budget. Okay. Well, they need some information about that. It's not unreasonable to think we'd have to collect some sort of information on that, and that's our M step, right? But the type of information collected from that assessment, broadly, how well are kids doing, is not the type of information that is likely to be able to actually inform instruction. So knowing a child is scores proficient on M-STEP doesn't actually give us information about what they know and are able to do so that we can figure out next steps to support that student's learning in the classroom. Still, it's important to have this information. It's just not the information that we want that teachers are able to do much with instructionally. Here's another example. Classroom teachers want to see what decoding strategy a child knows in order to decide which strategies to teach next. Okay. This feels like a great place for observation, right? What we have to do to figure out what decoding strategies kids know is watch and listen as they read and they get to a word that they've never seen before, and they have to do something to figure that out, right? And if we see them guessing, or if we see them looking up at us as the teacher waiting for us to tell them, then we know that they need support, right? To have some strategies that they can use independently to support themselves as readers. So this is a great example of where observation is probably going to be the best possible way to know what kids are up to. Okay, so I share all of those examples because we collect a lot of data for a lot of different purposes in our school systems. That's okay. We want as best as possible to streamline those, right? So kids are not being tested all day, but we also have to understand that there is data that's required for different purposes, for different questions. But it's really important to understand what we can and cannot get from a particular assessment. And if we're looking for classroom level information. What do I teach tomorrow? What does this child know today? What we need is teachers to be gathering that information on a regular basis. And it's going to look something like the video that I showed you earlier. Okay, so the last area I really want to talk about is this idea of build on the strengths of each child. So we've talked a little bit about it, right? Because we want to understand what children, you keep hearing me say, what are children able to do in order to move forward in their learning. And what I wanted to do and have you all do in discussion groups is really think carefully about this idea of building on the strengths of each child in terms of the enabling conditions that are in the front matter of the updated essential document. So I know you all have copies of this, or you can find it online really quickly, literacyessentials.org, K3 document, right? And in the front, there's a section that's called enabling conditions. And in particular, what it says is use of the essential instructional practices in early literacy should occur in a school day that's supportive and effective for children, not only in literacy, but in all areas of development. There are many wide-ranging conditions that enable children to thrive in all school subjects and domains, including literacy. And a few key examples of those conditions are an asset orientation towards children and their families and communities, positive relationships between and among teachers, children, and families, opportunities for children to develop healthy identities, culturally relevant, responsive, and sustaining pedagogical approaches through the day, and sufficient time for physical activity, meals, and play. So when we think of building on the strengths of each child through, and we consider what that means in terms of assessment, what I'm hoping that you'll discuss in your small groups are what connections you see between those enabling conditions and Essential 9, and how we might be able to think about building on the strengths of each child around assessment. And even more important, how can we think about an asset orientation to children and their families and communities as it relates to assessment? And think about the kinds of conversations we have with families about assessments and the interpretation of those assessments. So I think I'm going to send it over to someone who knows the processes of Zoom to put folks in discussion groups for a little bit, maybe 10 minutes.
Yeah, sounds great, Tanya.
Those were some, hopefully those were some fruitful conversations. At the classroom teacher level, really thinking about how we can engage with kids in ways that are asset oriented, right? Including things like explaining to kids what we're up to so that they're aware of the goals and purposes and that they can set their own learning goals. The not on that is not doing things to kids like sharing assessment data in ways that are not helpful or productive or make them feel successful as learners, right? And there are really some ways we can talk with kids differently about assessments. Like, I'm interested in figuring out everything that you already know so we can work together on what you need to learn next, is really different to why don't you, I know we don't say this directly, but it feels like this to kids, why are you not further along yet? Right? Or why can't you do this yet? We don't say it in those words, but we sometimes are saying it implicitly. So we just have to think really carefully. And then we also really need to think carefully about how we talk with families about assessment data. Some of you have heard me talk about this before. But just saying, look where your child is, especially if maybe kids are not making progress in ways families may want, in a way that seems to blame or be harmful to families in any way is really not what we want to see, and not an asset orientation towards working with families together, which towards kids. And what we'd rather see is working with families together to create the most supportive opportunities for children to learn and grow, and assuming that families always assuming that families want the best for their children, and want to work in whatever way they can to be supportive of their children. So in addition to an asset orientation and broadly the climate around assessment that we are creating in schools, just some other reminders about ways that coaches can be leaders in their school and district communities around assessment. Really important to always be having conversations about different assessments for different purposes. What questions are we trying to answer with this assessment? And can we, in fact, answer the question we are hoping to with this assessment? We're still seeing a lot in schools where we think we can answer classroom level questions about what will happen tomorrow from screener assessments, and that is just not the case. And also, just, in parentheses, beyond the scope of what we're going to talk about today, many assessments actually churn out different scores, and we really need to make sure we're using the correct score from an assessment. Here I'm talking about the assessments we are using as instrument assessments or computer-based assessments, the correct score for our question. So we have to be very careful about that. Something you can help with is an assessment inventory. What are the assessments being given to kids, and what are their purposes? Sometimes we have overlapping or multiple assessments going on that really do the same thing in districts. And we need to look at that very carefully, and understand how much time kids are being assessed, particularly on tests out of context. Right now, I'm not talking about observation in the context of instruction. That's totally fine. We can do that as much as we want. But really pausing instruction for assessments. Why are we doing it? What is the purpose? What are we learning from this? Is it useful? Who needs this information? And perhaps there are opportunities to streamline what is going on to be more efficient in gathering the data that we need. And then, of course, supporting grade level teams with formative observations, right, to inform instruction, and rubrics for classroom use that are aligned to particular instructional targets, right? Doing the work of creating those is hard work. And we want to do them in ways that are bias-free and fair and careful. So that's a great place for coaches to work with teams who are interested in engaging in formative assessment around literacy. So just a few ideas, in case you don't have enough to do, to support assessments in the schools and districts that you are working with at sort of a leadership level. All right, well, that's all I have for you today. Thanks for having me, and thanks for being here.